Buenos días a todos. Good morning, Ambassador. Este programa será en inglés, por lo que cambio ese idioma. Australia and Mexico could hardly be further apart in geographic terms, and yet they have long shared similar objectives in economic and trade policies, the subject matter of today's webinar. Thank you very much, Ambassador Moretta, for accepting this invitation. We're really delighted to have you. Our moderator, Dr. Maria Cristina Hernández Strategic, will give you a proper introduction. Let me just say that Dr. Hernández is a well-known professional in trade issues and international negotiations, with a vast career in government, both in Mexico and abroad. She's an associate at SAI Derecho y Economía, and holds, among others, a PhD in law by the University of Paris, and she's also a member of our organization, COMEXI. Maria Cristina, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I would like, first of all, to thank COMEXI for this invitation. It is a great pleasure and an honor for me to share this webinar with His Excellency Ambassador Remo Moretta to talk about Mexico-Australia relations with focus on trade. Ambassador Moretta is a career officer with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and was most recently Assistant Secretary at the Europe Trade UK and Ireland branch. He has previously served overseas as Deputy Head of Mission at the Australian High Commission in Wellington, New Zealand, as Counselor at the Australian Embassy in Washington, and as First Secretary at the Australian Permanent Mission to the World Trade Organization in Geneva. He holds a Bachelor of Social Science from Curtin University, Australia, and we will hear from him about the different aspects that make up the bilateral relationship between Mexico and Australia. I will now confine myself to two general remarks. First, as you mentioned, that despite the geographical distance between the two nations, bilateral relations are quite rich, mature, and healthy, having still a large potential for being strengthened through cooperation in several areas. And second, that Australia is an important partner for Mexico. And this is why I congratulate COMEXI for the initiative of holding this event to deepen a little bit our knowledge on the various aspects of this relationship. So Ambassador Moretta, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. It's an absolute pleasure for me to be with you here today. I really appreciate the warm, welcoming remarks. I can only say that equally we share the sentiments with Mexico and all of its good officials and ambassadors. The relationship between Mexico and Australia is much closer than people would imagine. Yes, we are geographically situated at opposite ends of the world in different hemispheres, but in terms of our relationship, we share so much. We are very similar in size. We are the 14th and the 15th largest economies in the world. So we're in the G20 together. We're part of APEC. We're part of the United Nations. We're in the World Trade Organization. We have an alliance with NICTA, which is, important. Mexico, Indonesia, Korea, and Australia and Turkey. And we are in the OECD. I mean, we are almost members of every organization one could imagine on the face of the planet, and our agendas are very, very similar. They align very, very much. In the last few years, the relationship has actually grown significantly between Australia and Mexico, especially on the trade front, but not only on the trade front. We have grown economically, culturally, and politically. When it comes to the economic relationship, it's grown by virtue of two principal platforms. One is that if you look at the investment flows over the last 3 years, Australia has become the 7th largest new source of foreign direct investment in the Mexican economy. This is creating jobs and helping to stimulate the Mexican economy. The other element of the bilateral relationship, which is extremely important, is that we are now members of the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. I don't like the acronym, but I do like the fact that we are part of a very diverse and dynamic agreement, which will enable two things. First of all, it will enable us to be part of the dynamism of the economic growth, which will be the engine of growth in the foreseeable future, which is in the Asia-Pacific region. But it will also help us to diversify our market interests. Being overexposed to any one particular market can have its consequences in a downturn or when things don't go well. Having diversified market access interests is really important at this particular time going forward. At the multilateral level, and I think it's really important for us to talk about our relationship at the multilateral level, we are members of the World Trade Organization, and now, given the challenges to the international rules-based order, I think it's very important that countries like Mexico and Australia that are trade dependent actually work together collaboratively to address the challenges we face to the international rules-based order. We need to have a Director General appointed very, very quickly. That organization cannot be without a Director General for very long. And I know that Mexico and Australia have significant interest in making sure that we get the WTO back to good working order. So we know that Mexico and Australia have very similar interests, and we will work together in the World Trade Organization. When it comes to our political relationship, that too is very, very important. I mentioned MICTA as being a forum in which countries of a similar nature can get together to discuss geostrategic interests. But as Mexico heads into its term on the Security Council, we stand ready to work with Mexico on a range of different positions which matter to the international rules-based system, whether it's the abolishment of the death penalty, whether it's advancing the interests of women and the rights of women, whether it comes to good international rules-based order and decision-making and reforms of the United Nations. These are all really important issues and ones that we stand ready to work with Mexico on. Culturally, we are distant countries, and but slowly and surely, people-to-people links are increasing, and day by day, they're deepening our relationship. Australia and Mexico share important cultural elements in terms of our own history. We're both colonies of former colonial powers. We both have indigenous peoples. And so one of the priorities that we have here is to broaden and deepen our engagement at the political level and the cultural level, and to look at things like, well, what has worked for Mexico in terms of indigenous policies in education, in health, in economic development, and we stand ready to share our experiences about what has and has not worked in indigenous education and health and economic development. But looking at the trade relationship, which is very, very important for our two economies, major exports from Australia to Mexico include fertilizers, non-electrical machinery, coal, meat, and ores and concentrates. But we run a trade deficit with Mexico, and Mexico would be delighted to hear that, of course. The major exports from Mexico to Australia are passenger motor vehicles, telecommunication equipment and parts, alcoholic beverages, medical instruments, and computers. So we have a complementarity in terms of the trade between us, but there is scope for that to grow, and scope for that to grow significantly, especially now that we are part of the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. At the end of the day, Australian investors are looking to invest here in Mexico across a range of different sectors, not only in the energy sector, but also in mining, in professional services. We have an increasing education export interest in Mexico. The number of students going to Australia to study in Australia or studying abroad from Australia are growing significantly. And these are areas of complementarity between our two economies. So when you look at the totality of our relationship, it's broadening, it's becoming more complex, it's becoming deeper, and it's not just bilaterally. It's regionally, it's multilaterally, it's at every single level. And I'm actually delighted to be the ambassador to Mexico, because for us, Mexico is a bright opportunity and a great partner at every level. Now, I'm not one for PowerPoints and I'm not one for slides. I'm one for a conversation. So I'd love to have a chat with anybody about our relationship. I'll leave it at that, and hopefully there'll be some engagement with us.
Thank you, Ambassador. I mean, it's a short presentation, but very rich. And it makes clear that Mexico and Australia maintain mutually beneficial relations, that both countries hold a fluid political dialogue at every level. And thanks for your support in the UN, by the way. I mean, I'm not representing Mexico, but as Mexican. So both countries share common visions on global challenges. And that's why they are partners and are cooperating in forums, as you mentioned, as OECD, APEC, G20, MICTA, and the WTO. They develop increasingly cultural and people-to-people relations, you also mentioned that, and a growing bilateral investment relation. I mean, flows are increasing. And as you may not have mentioned, but Mexico, in fact, is the biggest trade partner of Australia in Latin America. And
yes.
Then you mentioned the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. I don't like either the acronyms, but having been part of that negotiation, I must say that it was very painful to conclude these negotiations, and even with that acronym is a great success, and we welcome this agreement. So this agreement entered into force between Australia and Mexico in December 2018, actually 30th of December, 1 day before the new year. So this agreement is definitely there to consolidate our relations potential. So now focusing on the economic and trade arenas you also wanted us to do. You mentioned that both economies are open to the world and complementary to each other. And yet we observe that Australia, for Mexico, as of today, is the trade partner number 21 in terms of exports, with 0.22% of total Mexico's exports going to Australia. Australia is trade partner number 50 in terms of imports, with only 0.08% of total Mexico's imports coming from Australia. What makes Australia Mexico's trade partner number 36, sharing only 0.15% of Mexico's total trade. I mean, the potential is enormous, but the reality as we see it now is quite limited. We are not exploding this potential. So which are the areas where you see precisely more potential for trade complementarity in the future? And in your opinion, where lie the key opportunities for Australian traders and investors in Mexico and vice versa? And in this connection, I think it's unavoidable to remark that with over 80% of its exports going to the United States, Mexico has long declared to be keen to move away from its reliance in the US market and diversify its trade and investment relations, including in the Asia-Pacific region. In this regard, do you consider that Mexico is undertaking serious or truly proactive efforts to achieve this goal? I leave it at that, my question.
Thank you. Look, I think you're absolutely correct in remarking and observing that the bilateral trade, two-way trade in goods and services relationship between Mexico and Australia is quite modest, and it has potential to grow. But what was missing is a platform on which to build that trade relationship. Because as you know, the majority of the world trade is done under preferential trading arrangements. It's not done under, as we say in the World Trade Organization, most favored nation trading arrangements. And we didn't have a bilateral free trade agreement with Mexico until we became part of the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. So I think now we have the platform to link us, but not just link us bilaterally, link us regionally. So where I see prospects for growth in the bilateral relationship is by virtue of the integrated nature of regional trade. Mexico and Australia being part of the interconnected supply chains in the region. The complementarity between us is that on the agriculture side, we are counter-cyclical. So we have Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere taking advantage of different growing seasons. So we can continue to supply without actually being in competition necessarily on the agriculture front. On the manufacturing side, Mexico has a much broader manufacturing base than Australia. And it is true, as you have remarked, that 80% of Mexican exports go to the United States. So that exposure, reliance on the US market is very similar to the reliance that Australia has on China and Southeast Asia, but in particular China. So we too are very similar to Mexico in terms of being linked very significantly into preferential arrangements with major trading partners. And it is very difficult to move away from that. But we see genuine attempts to now look at diversification of markets. You will hear many people now talking about the need to diversify market interests. But what that requires is the integration of international supply chains. That then leads me to, the only thing that really has kept trade going at a time where we have seen increased protectionist measures from certain countries has been the international supply chain connection. That is what has kept trade going in the right direction. But it's under severe strain. It's under severe strain by those that want to look inwards, not outwards. It's under severe strain by those that want the World Trade Organization to be reformed, but don't actually have a clear idea as to what that reform would look like. For us, we want to look at not only reforms to the dispute settlement system, but also to the way that the negotiating arm of the World Trade Organization operates. For far too long, unfortunately, market access negotiations have proved almost impossible because of the North-South divide. Whenever you get into a conversation about market access in the World Trade Organization, you get into a conversation about special and differential treatment. And the minute you start talking about special and differential treatment, you start talking about polarized positions about who should make more cuts, who should deliver more market access, and who should be excluded from having to do so. So there are problems multilaterally. But in terms of our bilateral relationship, I think it's going to be incrementally a situation where we look to use the TPP in a way that integrates our supply chains regionally in the Asia-Pacific region, particularly, which is going to be the engine of growth for the foreseeable future. The CPTPP, once it will be ratified by all parties, and we and Mexico are working together to try and urge those that have not yet ratified the CPTPP to actually do so, to increase the commercial viability of the CPTPP with significant markets and over 500 million consumers, it will be an important dimension of our future trading relationship. But you are right, the modest trade between us has room to grow, and we stand ready to grow that trade because the complementarities between our two economies are obvious.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yes, let's hope so. You mentioned that the CPTPP, of course, gives us the platform because it's the very first free trade agreement between Australia and Mexico. And it's not only a trade agreement, it's a comprehensive agreement, as the name says, including investor chapters, dispute settlement mechanism that in the meantime, while the WTO is not necessarily working very well because the body is in paralysis, we at least have this mechanism. Hopefully we will not have disputes, but if ever occur, then we have this mechanism. So you mentioned that you see more opportunities for us to take advantage of CPTPP via our participation in the value chains. So all these production chains that connect us not only bilaterally but with our partners in the agreement, including Japan, notably, including our Pacific Alliance partners, Canada, and so on. So, but with and you also mentioned that these value chains are under strain because of protectionist kind of temptations that have been actually intensified by the pandemic. You know, we have seen in Mexico, we have experienced several companies, many companies that belong are inserted into the value chains suffering because in some countries, like in Mexico, they were closed, while in the US or in Japan and elsewhere, they were not closed, but they were relying on inputs coming from Mexico, and so the chains were broken for quite a while. And there have been declarations coming from you know, some authorities in other countries saying that we should not rely anymore on those global value chains or regional value chains, that we should produce inwards, inside our own economies. I mean, this is the case of the US. So do you still think that the global or regional value chains within the CPTPP have potential to be developed and strengthened in spite of the situation of this pandemic, which we don't know when it's going to be controlled?
Yes, look, it's a very good question. And all I can say is that the beauty about the CPTPP is that the rules of origin, which determine so much about how the supply chains work, is cumulative. So the rules of origin are trade liberalizing. If you have a rule of origin which states that you need a regional value content element in order to get the preference, then it's cumulative. You can actually count the inputs from a number of different countries, not just one country, to actually achieve the goal of meeting the requirements to get the preferential arrangement applied to your exports. Moreover, the CPTPP is liberalizing not just because of the rules of origin and how they work on a cumulative basis, but also because it seeks to remove red tape. You only need one export certificate of origin and you can self-certify, and that will be valid in all 11 economies. So these are the sorts of measures which will strengthen the international supply chains between the 11 partners of the CPTPP. The unfortunate situation is that when you rely on a bilateral free trade agreement with a major partner, there is a tendency to want to protect industry domestically and therefore make it very difficult for the preference to be accorded to the trading partner, thereby actually interrupting the supply chain as opposed to strengthening the supply chain. What we in Australia want to see, and this is why we are continually talking to Mexico, is how do we make sure that international supply chains remain open? How do we make sure that inputs consumed in the production processes are complementary? And how we can benefit from the trade liberalization that the CPTPP delivers.
Yeah, thank you very much. To follow on the same line, you know, the agreements, the new agreements, Australia is also negotiating with Mexico and the other Pacific Alliance partners of Mexico, Chile, Colombia, and Peru, a new agreement. So Australia is a candidate to become an associate state of the Pacific Alliance. as I recall, the agreement by the Pacific Alliance countries to establish the figure of associate states was reached in Viña del Mar in March 2017, at the time when the United States withdrew from the TPP. And this happened because in the absence of the US in the TPP, the future of this deal was put into question, what made the Pacific Alliance be considered a possible platform or a pathway to realize the benefits of the TPP. So to bring the kind of package of TPP and use this platform, the Pacific Alliance, to realize the benefits of TPP. So with this in mind, the figure of associate state was created and negotiations were launched with Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Canada, and that's it, 4 countries. All of them CPTPP partners, and at the same time, the 11 countries that remain in the TPP, once the US left, which included 3 PA countries, Chile, Mexico, and Peru, and the 4 country candidates to become associate states, agreed, so the 11 agreed to explore options to put TPP into effect. Happily, this effort resulted in the conclusion of the CPTPP. So against this background, since the CPTPP has successfully concluded and is already in force, don't you think that it becomes a bit redundant to pursue yet another agreement with the Pacific Alliance, particularly considering that Australia has concluded quite ambitious bilateral agreement recently with Peru, and also has an ambitious agreement with Chile, and that the Pacific Alliance agreement is much less ambitious than CPTPP in terms of rules, and particularly in rules of origin, as you know, the importance of rules of origin you already highlighted. So how do you see the logic of this, to pursue these negotiations if they were kind of alternative pathways to realize the TPP benefits?
It's a very good question.
And what do you expect from that? In reality.
Well, these days with the pandemic, my expectations are realistic, and I need to keep them in check. But the question of whether or not the Pacific Alliance is redundant because of the CPTPP depends on the quality of the outcome of the negotiations under the Pacific Alliance. It depends on the level of ambition that we can reach under the Pacific Alliance. It would not be viable for us to accept a lesser agreement necessarily than the CPTPP delivers, because as you know, traders, if you're a trader, you need to understand the terms of the trade deal. You need to understand what benefits are to be derived if you opt into the use of one agreement over another. And unfortunately, it's not a case where I can choose the rules of origin of one agreement, the tariff of this agreement, or the standards of that agreement, and put them all together to make a trade agreement that I like. It's not that simple. So the redundancy of the Pacific Alliance really rests with whether or not it can match the efficacy and the ambition that has been reached in the CPTPP. So we look forward to continuing to engage and make progress on the Pacific Alliance, so that we can actually reach a benchmark which is commercially meaningful and viable for traders who might not necessarily see the CPTPP as advantageous to them, but might see the Pacific Alliance as advantageous. Australia, like Mexico, has many free trade agreements. And our traders opt into one agreement versus another agreement based on their supply chains, based on the inputs consumed in the production process, based on whether or not the standards and technical regulations are easy to meet or not easy to meet. So there is a calculation in the minds of the traders always as to which agreement benefits. The reason why we have so many free trade agreements is to give them that option, to give them that choice, to give them that platform. So hopefully what we will continue to do under the Pacific Alliance is to continue to make progress so that we have a viable, commercially meaningful, high-level agreement which traders can opt into if they find that other agreements don't suit their needs.
Good luck.
Yes.
No, I understand your point, but it's a tough negotiation, as you well know, and the agricultural sector being quite a sensitive sector for Colombia and other countries. But yeah, it's worth pursuing, as you say. It's understandable Australia's position on that. Yes.
Well, and also we have to recall that not all of the members of the Pacific Alliance are members of the CPTPP.
Right.
And so it's an opportunity for us to actually engage, hopefully in a commercially meaningful way, with new bilateral trading partners that are not part of the CPTPP. That said, of course, as you know, there is an accession clause in the CPTPP, and provided countries can meet the requirements and the standards of that agreement, we are open to new members. At the moment, our focus is to try and get all of the members currently to ratify. Mexico and Australia were first movers. We ratified very early to take advantage of the commercial opportunities, but we hope the CPTPP will be ratified by all members very, very soon. But as you know, domestic ratification processes of international treaties is different in every country, and they can take a long time depending on the domestic processes that are required under law. But I do want to mention something, and that is, I want to go back to one organisation to which we both belong. It's the regional initiative APEC. And I want to mention how important this is, not just for Australia, but for Mexico too. It's important because APEC brings in China and various other countries that other regional forums do not. But the beauty about APEC is that, unlike the World Trade Organization, which is of course legally binding, and has the dispute settlement system, which has come under strain of late, APEC is best endeavours. It's not legally binding. It enables countries to actually share best practice, especially in the area of trade facilitation and customs. And it's that really important relationship that has actually helped enormously in liberalising trade in the APEC region in significant ways. We are working with Mexico at the moment bilaterally on standards and accreditation systems in a very important sector, the hospitality industry, the tourism sector. These are important parts of your economy, Mexico's economy. They're important parts of Australia's economy. And the tourism and hospitality sector is under significant strain because of the pandemic. While we work on those initiatives in APEC, we hope that we will actually have a very trade facilitating platform for standards of accreditation across all APEC economies in this important area. So APEC is a really important regional element to not only our bilateral engagement, but our regional engagement. And I think all too often it's not mentioned enough or not stressed enough in terms of its importance.
That's correct. You are totally right. I have witnessed that, because I was representative of Mexico to APEC as senior official for a couple of years, and I could realize the importance that that platform provides for incubating ideas, incubating initiatives. And I think this initiative you are talking about in terms of trade facilitation is a very important. It is more important for Mexico than for Australia, I must say, because while Australia is around, I think, among the 30 top countries in trade facilitating, as trade facilitating economies, Mexico is below the 50 number. So yes, that's very important. Now that you are mentioning APEC, let me talk a little bit about Australia's vocation, multilateral vocation, because as I said, for many years I witnessed this is truly something that Australia has in its foreign policy. Being member of the WTO, OECD, G20, APEC, MICTA, Mexico is also part of that, but Australia was key, I recall, key in creating APEC and in creating MICTA. And it's because you have this vision of, you know, how the world is moving and the political power, and being so kind of isolated. I can imagine that for Australia it's absolutely important to be connected and have these platforms that link you to the world and to the important regions. So I have witnessed that Australia is extremely proactive and constructive player in all of them. And as you said, given the commonality of interest between the two countries, as regard preserving strengthening the multilateralism and the rule of law in international trade and in other areas, both countries have indeed collaborated very tightly in these fora. But now, this is a tricky question. I hope you don't mind. But with the new guidelines on foreign policy by the current administration in Mexico, this being that the best foreign policy is domestic policy applied by the new administration, does Australia still consider Mexico a key partner and a key player in multilateral arena? You have already said yes, but in reality, have you seen a change or do you see an absence of Mexico in these international fora? Because I mean, it's not surprising to say that the policy in Mexico now is to do from home and to focus on domestic policy rather than foreign policy. So how do you see Mexico being, you know, the presence of Mexico nowadays in those fora? And if Mexico is getting kind of a little bit absent from multilateral fora, does this require more bilateral efforts or create more bilateral channels to intensify or to strengthen cooperation between Australia and Mexico, or do you think things have not changed?
I'll be honest with you. We have not seen a withdrawal from Mexico on the international stage. If anything, we have seen Mexico maintain a very active posture on the international stage, whether it's in the United Nations, whether it's in the World Trade Organization, whether it's in MICTA, whether it's in the OECD. You have many candidates for international positions. You are part of the G20. Mexico participates in the G20. We have not seen a change in posture. Now, priorities articulated by leaders are sometimes different necessarily from what they actually do on the world stage. I know that, for example, Australia's Prime Minister is very focused on the economy back home. I know that the Prime Minister is focused on the health and safety of Australian citizens. I know that the Prime Minister is focused on a whole raft of different domestic issues. That's not different to Mexico. But we maintain a very active posture on the international stage as well, as does Mexico. You know, I want to get back to one issue about, you know, the way we see the world. Once upon a time, we used to refer to the tyranny of distance because we were so far away from the rest of the world that, you know, it was, you know, we either ship goods by ship or by plane. We don't have any borders contiguous with other countries. So for us, we are trade dependent and we sit at the bottom of the Southern Hemisphere looking up at the entire world. So for us, 1 in 4 jobs depends on trade. We are very, very outwardly focused as a nation. We are a very big country, but we're only 25, 26 million people. So we need to be linked to the rest of the world.
Sure.
But that distance geographically does not equate to the way we are integrated globally now. And this is why countries like Australia, in partnership with Japan and Singapore, are leading on the negotiations on the digital economy, on e-commerce, because this is an important sector that will enable us to continue to grow our economies, particularly in a post-COVID environment. So we see things very much through the eyes of interconnection is best. This is what drives Australia's policies of engagement, whether it's at the WTO or whether it's in the United Nations. But in terms of bilateral efforts to engage Mexico, we haven't had to do a lot more than we already were doing before. Mexico for us is an open door. We have a very similar agenda. We have a very similar outlook. We have very similar positions, and we work well together. And that is the most important thing to remember, is that, you know, coming into an organization where you have a similar position is a great start to a great relationship. And that's what drives our two economies forward.
That's very, very good news. I mean, to us to hear that, and of course, it's fantastic. It's an incredible relationship. So, Ambassador, let me just touch upon investment, and then we open the floor for questions from the audience.
Okay.
On investment, we noticed that in recent years, Australia has emerged as one of Mexico's largest sources of foreign investment, especially in infrastructure and in the energy sector. According to data from the Ministry of Economy, there are more than 260 companies with Australian participation in Mexico already, which have materialized investments that amount to almost $5 billion US dollars from January 2001 to June this year, 2020, representing less than 1% of FDI received by Mexico, but very importantly in key sectors. So could you enlighten us a little bit on precisely these key sectors or projects that where Australian investors are involved or interested? And also in the face of recent Mexican federal government actions in energy and mining sectors, which have arguably created uncertainty about the government's promise to respect what was done in the past, i.e. the energy reform. Do you consider that Mexico is changing the rules of the game for foreign investors and thus taking a risk of losing an opportunity to attract investment from Australia? Put in another way, are the expectations of Australian investors already established in Mexico, or prospects of potential investors being affected by such recent Mexico's government actions or measures?
Okay. Firstly, to the question of the attractiveness of the Mexican market, it's of course because of its size. The market is a very big market, but also its geostrategic location in proximity to the United States and Canada, and also Central America and Latin America. So for us, it's very much a geostrategically well-placed market, but in and of itself, it's still a very significant market economically. Our interests, the foreign investors from Australia are in the energy sector, as you pointed out, in the mining sector, as you pointed out, but also we bring very high standards to mining equipment technology services, where Australia has a very large comparative advantage, being that we do have such large mining companies and, you know, significant interests in that area. But we're also increasingly looking at different areas such as professional services, and where we're represented in a multitude of different sectors. So at the end of the day, you know, obviously all investors look for transparency, predictability, and stability in a market, because those are the fundamentals that companies look for when they're investing in markets. At the moment, I have been talking to a range of different Australian investors, and things are going relatively well. Foreign investment, the pipelines of capital that is coming into Mexico are important not just for creating jobs, and not just important for helping to stimulate the economy, but also as a feed into some of the major infrastructure programs that Mexico is endeavoring to put in place to stimulate the economy, especially in the south. So Australian companies have been telling me that the story is positive. Obviously, our role is to continue to look at what legislative and regulatory reforms are being contemplated, and to see whether or not they present for us challenges. You know, we have recently undertaken reforms of our Foreign Acquisition Takeover Act in Australia, as well as our investment regime. All governments are addressing the issue of foreign investment very carefully at the moment because of the pandemic, but also because there are a number of distressed companies, and, you know, they need to look very, very carefully at whether or not those are subject to hostile takeovers, or, you know, so every country is facing the same set of dynamics at the moment because the global pandemic is truly global, and the global impact on the economies are truly global. So nobody is sitting in the boat by itself. We're all sitting in the same boat, and we all face the same challenges. So we will continue to work cooperatively and collaboratively with the government of Mexico, particularly as it relates to any legislation or regulation that may impact the operation of our investors in the Mexican economy, but so too are many other countries that are investing in Mexico. And Mexico has made clear to us that it wants to remain a source, an attractive source of foreign direct investment, and we continue to work towards that end. Australian companies would not be investing if they didn't think the proposition was a viable proposition. So we will continue to work collaboratively with Mexico and our own companies towards that endeavour.
Excellent. And it's also worth recalling that the CPTPP also provides an important instrument, which is the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism, in case there are violations of the rules established in the agreement, like non-discrimination, fair and equitable treatment, etc. So companies already established in Mexico can have recourse to that. So that's a kind of insurance policy that the CPT provides us. So thank you, Ambassador. I will pass to the questions that our audience is sending to you. So we have Luis Rubio with a question. This says, Mexico and Australia share another rather odd similarity, albeit in opposite directions. Australia is a solid member of the West, a member of the Five Eyes group, and so on. Yet, its balance sheet, as it were, is solid with China. Mexico is not a traditional member of the West, but its balance sheet is with the US. How do you think Australia will end up leaning should the US and China further deepen their current conflict?
We are faced with this question on a daily basis, and we are very much linked to China economically. It is our largest export destination. We don't deny that. We have a free trade agreement with China, which is comprehensive. It covers goods, services, and investment. But we also have a free trade agreement with the United States, and we are an alliance partner. At the end of the day, we are multilateralists, and we encourage parties with differences to engage constructively, both bilaterally and multilaterally, to resolve their differences. At the end of the day, for us, it's not choosing one against the other. It's working cooperatively with both in the shared interests of making sure that we have a rules-based system with norms that apply to everybody. At the end of the day, we are part of the Indo-Pacific region, and our development assistance programs, our foreign policy is very much focused on that region because that's where we reside geographically, and that's where most of our trade occurs. But we understand the importance of alliances and partnerships and working constructively with all countries. It's not a binary choice for us. It's not the Washington consensus versus the Beijing consensus. It's working collaboratively with both countries and respecting the international rules-based system. This is why our focus is on trying to make sure that everybody meets the challenges of addressing the strains of the international rules-based system and making sure they work in the interests of everybody, not just those two powers.
Right. That's very, very, very good response. Thank you so much. We have a question from Veronica Ortiz. Where should the WTO be headed? What kind of leadership is needed to make rule-based trade effective?
It's a very good question. When we talk about leadership, I have two different perspectives on leadership, because I actually spent 4 years as one of the market access negotiators in the World Trade Organization. I was the chairman of the Customs Valuation Committee. I was also chairman of the Subsidies and Countervailing Measures Committee. And I worked very closely with all members of the WTO. Leadership in the World Trade Organization is both in terms of the members themselves being responsible leaders and the leader of the organization. When it comes to leadership in the World Trade Organization, many countries claim to be leaders and try to forge deals. But in doing so, we need to be mindful of the fact that the membership of the World Trade Organization is the leader of the World Trade Organization. It is the membership that drives the World Trade Organization. It is the membership that actually determines its future direction. We hope that we can collaboratively work with other members of the World Trade Organization to reform the institution so that it works to the benefit of all members. That's not easy. And we need to step up and meet that challenge. Now, when it comes to the leader of the organisation, we are currently in a process to select the next Director General of the World Trade Organisation. That for Australia is a person who not only understands the World Trade Organisation, has experience in the negotiating arm and the rules arm of the World Trade Organisation, but is also somebody politically connected who can actually talk to leaders of the world and forge a deal. Because many times you will see that there is an impasse in the World Trade Organization, and that needs to be broken. And the way that that happens is for a leader to pick up the phone and talk to other leaders and say, we need compromise here. We need to actually settle our differences in a way that's in the interests of all members, whether they are least developed countries, developing countries, economies in transition, or developed economies. One of the fundamental problems that the World Trade Organization has had in the past is this whole question around what is a developing country and what is not a developing country, and how the negotiations are between the North and the South, the old dichotomy between the North and the South, the developed and the developing world. I think that we really need to address that issue, and unless we do address that issue, we will find that market access negotiations are not going to be possible in the World Trade Organization. I don't think we'll have another global round of negotiations. That's my own personal view. But at the end of the day, we're all members of the World Trade Organization, and that organization needs to serve our interests. And the leadership on trade needs to come from everyone, not just the major economies. Right.
May I add something to that? Do you think that the way ahead should be based on, in negotiations, should be based on sectorial agreements where not everyone is forced to join? I mean, we have multilateral, we have tried everything, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we have used plurilateral agreements in the past as a means of advancing trade liberalisation. The Information Technology Agreement, Phase 1, was not universal. It was plurilateral. You could opt in or opt out. Information Technology Agreement, Phase 2, was similarly about product expansion and membership expansion, but it wasn't universal. The Government Procurement Agreement in the World Trade Organization was plurilateral, not universal. We were not an original signatory to the GPA in the World Trade Organization. At the moment, we're looking at various plurilateral initiatives being negotiated on services, as well as, for example, the Digital E-commerce Agreement. These are all initiatives to try and move forward with the trade liberalisation agenda amongst a coalition of the willing. Now, at the end of the day, all we can hope is that by positive example and liberalisation and realising the positive elements of that liberalisation, that others will join.
Will attract others. Mm-hmm. Okay, Ambassador, I will run into other questions because there are several of them. So I will, this is the following one. Says, what would it mean for the CPTPP member countries if ultimately the United Kingdom joins the agreement? Do you believe they will benefit from it? I mean, the others, right? If UK comes in, even though the UK is geographically apart from the Pacific region. So they having the UK eventually becoming a member of CPTPP. How do you see that?
Sure. Look, at the end of the day, Australia has made clear that its position is that we are open to new members. Now, you cannot deny that the United Kingdom in and of itself is a major economy. You know, and that sort of a market brings enormous benefits and commercial gravitas to what is already a significant agreement. Now, at the end of the day, it would all depend on whether or not the United Kingdom can meet the requirements and the standards of the CPTPP. I think that their intention is that they would want to, but at the moment, they really do need to establish a baseline for trade relations with the European Union. I think that irrespective of global supply chains, you know, the distance is a factor. I mean, Australia and Mexico are very far apart, yet we're part of the CPTPP. So I don't know that distance has anything to play here. What is a critical issue is whether or not acceding countries or aspirational countries who want to join can meet the standards of the CPTPP. That is the most important part. We do not want the standards of the CPTPP diluted. That the minute you start to do that, you erode the efficacy and the value of the agreement. That is our standard criteria, and we will continue to enforce that.
Thank you. We had another question from Ambassador Fernando de Mateo, but I think he's leaving the room. He says, but his question is how the WTO reform take place without having some kind of negotiations round. You referred to this already a little bit with your views on sectorials, but do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that, look, my own view is that you don't need a round to reform the WTO.
Right.
You just need a meeting of the minds in the various bodies that exist within the WTO, whether that's the General Council, whether that's the Goods Council, whether that's the Services Council. Reform can be managed within the existing structure of the WTO. It provides for that in the Marrakesh Agreement, it provides for that in the General Agreement on Trade, Tariffs and Trade, and it provides for that under the General Agreement on Trade and Services. I don't know that you need a round to reform the WTO. You need a meeting of the minds.
Right. So why don't we take a last question? It says, apart from diversification of trade relations, what other incentives and mechanisms do Mexican companies, exporters and investors have toward entering the Australian markets? I would modify a little bit this question and say, apart from market access, what other incentives and mechanisms do Mexican companies, exporters have and investors have towards entering the Australian markets? Maybe in order to talk a little bit about phytosanitary or non-market access measures. Do you think that is an issue between our two countries, particularly coming to Australia in the agricultural sector, for instance?
No, look, I don't think so. Look, all countries with bilateral market access relationships all have the same processes that we need to go to in terms of conducting import risk assessments and establishing protocols for the importation of agricultural goods. Mexico and Australia are no different. We've recently approved some market access requests for Mexico. We will continue to work on Mexican requests. Mexico will continue to work on Australian requests. That is a normal part of any bilateral relationship on agriculture. What I will get to is what is the attractiveness of the Australian market for Mexican investors and exporters is that we provide a platform that is a transparent, predictable, well-regulated market, which offers a springboard into Southeast Asia and North Asia. It's not just those Southeast Asian countries that are part of the CPTPP, but more broadly, the region. We offer in close proximity a very close engagement. Leaving aside trading goods, it's more important when we talk about trading services and investment. We offer a very good platform for hub and spoke arrangements into Southeast Asia and North Asia because of our geographic location and the way that our market is legislated, regulated, and managed.
Excellent. The last question, Ambassador, from Axel Cabrera. Despite the entry into force of CPTPP and the institutional efforts to make MICTA happen, we are still far apart from each other. It seems to me that the geographical distance between Australia and Mexico will always be a burden to having a greater relationship in social and economic terms. How to overcome this issue? Apart from the academic exchanges, what can be done to foster relations between Mexicans and Australians? In this regard, you have already mentioned the importance of participating in regional value productive chains, taking in advantage of CPTPP, but would you have something to add on this to respond to this question?
I do, and it's on the cultural front. Yes, education is going to be an important element. You know, students who study in Australia, students who study here in Mexico. We have an alumni of Mexican graduates who have graduated from Australian institutions. We work closely with them. It's a great group. These are alumni graduates from a number of different courses, a number of different degrees. They provide us with links into various people into Mexico. I think more can be made of having a conversation on social policy, such as Indigenous education, Indigenous health, and Indigenous economic development. We share a colonial history in common. We have much to gain from an exchange of information about policies and practices that have worked in the past and what has not worked in the past to try and determine what policies we should be applying in the future. We stand ready to work in multilateral regional fora, and you know, we are deepening our cultural ties here. It is true that the Mexican community in Australia is amongst the smallest of the Latin American, but it's growing steadily, and so too is the interests and not only in Mexican culture. I mean, leaving aside the trade and economic element of our relationship, which is probably the basis upon which our relationship functions, to be perfectly honest with you, we are trying to broaden, deepen, and make more sophisticated our exchange. I'm a person of Italian ancestry. My family came from Italy, and they migrated to Australia. And for me, the way culture determines behaviour is very similar to the way it happens here in Mexico. And so why bring that to the table as well? And that's how I want to broaden and deepen our cultural exchanges, and to broaden and deepen our understanding and our mutual respect for each other. It will grow over time, but we've been too focused on our specific regions for so long that we may have missed each other in the dance room.
That's true. That's true. You are totally right. We need to recognize each other and to get to know each other, and to know is to love, as one says. So I think after this conversation, Ambassador, we feel much closer to Australia, and I hope this is the feeling that all the audience has. I think I will pass the floor to the organizers for the last words, since now it's 11:07. Veronica, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cristina, for conducting this dynamic and such an enlightening conversation. Thank you, Ambassador Moretta, for your enthusiastic participation. It is a privilege for Mexico to have you as an ambassador, and for COMEXI to have the support and the Australian Embassy as our institutional associate. We will post the recording of this conversation on our webpage shortly, and we invite you to follow up there also for our upcoming events. On behalf of Luis Rubio and of Board of COMEXI, I thank you very much for this conversation, and have a very, very good day.
Thank you so much. It was an absolute honor and a pleasure for me to participate in today's event. And I hope that we can continue our conversation and we can continue our fruitful relationships.
Same here. Thank you very much, really.
My pleasure as well. Thank you so much.